I was sitting in the back row of a small literature club inside an old art cafe in Portland when I heard my wife Claire laugh quietly at one of Mason Reed's jokes. The room smelled like raincoats, old wood, and burnt espresso. Outside, water slid down the front windows in thin silver lines, blurring the streetlights along Hawthorne like wet paint. Inside, 12 people sat in a loose circle, discussing a novel most of them had only half read. Claire sat 3 chairs away from Mason. Not beside him. Not close enough to look obvious. Just close enough. He said something under his breath. Too low for the room, but not low enough for her. Claire looked down at her notebook and laughed softly. That laugh stopped me cold. It wasn't the polite laugh she gave neighbors. It wasn't the distracted laugh she used at work dinners when someone said something mildly clever. It was private, careful, familiar. The kind of laugh that belongs to 2 people who already have a history no one else is supposed to see. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the back of my wife's chair, and something inside me went still. For months, Mason Reed had been just a friend from book club. In that moment, I knew he wasn't. Before all of that, our life looked ordinary in the kind of way people spend years trying to build. Claire and I had lived in a quiet suburb outside Portland for almost 6 years. The neighborhood was full of damp sidewalks, trimmed hedges, and houses painted in careful neutral colors that all blurred together during the long Oregon winters. Every morning started the same way. Coffee brewing before sunrise. NPR humming softly from the kitchen radio. Claire sitting barefoot at the counter scrolling through design photos while I got ready for work. She worked as an interior designer for a boutique firm downtown. I worked claims management for an insurance company that specialized in commercial property disputes. Neither job was exciting enough to tell stories about at parties, but together they paid for our mortgage, our weekend trips, and the quiet little routines that slowly become a marriage. For a long time, I thought quiet meant stable. Books had always been Claire's thing. When we first dated, she used to leave novels all over my apartment. Dog-eared paperbacks on the couch. Poetry collections beside the bed. She loved underlining passages and reading them aloud like they carried secrets nobody else noticed. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with her. So when she joined a literature club downtown, I honestly thought it was good for her. She seemed lighter afterward, more energized, like she had found something that belonged only to her. At first, Mason Reed barely existed in conversation. Then slowly, he started appearing everywhere. Mason recommended this author. Mason hated that ending. Mason thought modern fiction relied too much on irony. Mason made everyone laugh during discussions. I noticed how often his name came up. Not enough to start a fight, just enough to stay in the back of my mind. One night while we cleaned dishes together, Claire smiled at a text message and turned her phone away without thinking. It happened so quickly most husbands probably would have ignored it. I almost did. Instead, I dried my hands slowly and asked who it was. Book club group chat, she answered immediately. Then she changed the subject before I could say anything else. And even then, standing there in our kitchen with rain tapping softly against the windows, I kept convincing myself it meant nothing. Nothing changed because of one dramatic discovery. There was no lipstick on a collar. No anonymous message. No hotel receipt left carelessly inside a coat pocket. It happened through details. Small ones. The kind you can ignore for months if you love someone enough. Claire started taking longer to get ready before literature club meetings. At first it was subtle. Different earrings. Better makeup. Dresses I hadn't seen in years suddenly hanging at the front of the closet again. One Thursday evening, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror trying on perfume while asking me what I wanted for dinner. That was the first moment the contrast bothered me. Her voice sounded casual. Her preparation didn't. Around the same time, her phone slowly stopped existing in open spaces. It used to sit face up on the kitchen counter while she cooked or folded laundry. Now it stayed beside her constantly, screen turned down like a reflex she didn't even realize she had developed. Whenever messages arrived, she answered quickly. Too quickly, like someone afraid of delays. I noticed other things too. Little shifts in timing. Club meetings running later than before. Extra wine afterward with the group. Sudden conversations about books she never mentioned around me because you probably wouldn't enjoy them. One night, I woke around midnight and found her sitting alone downstairs in the kitchen. The lights were off except for the glow above the stove. She was recording a voice message. I only heard a few seconds before she noticed movement upstairs. Claire laughed softly into the phone. Nervous, careful, intimate. The kind of laugh people use when they already know how they sound to someone else. Then she lowered her voice immediately. The next morning, she acted completely normal. That was almost worse. A week later, while we ate takeout on the couch, she casually mentioned the literature club had started hosting private creative evenings for regular members only. I remember the exact way she said it. Too casual, too rehearsed. I nodded and kept eating while the television flickered quietly across the room. But something had changed inside me by then. Not anger, not jealousy, recognition. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. For months, I had been treating every uncomfortable instinct like something immature I needed to suppress. Every inconsistency got explained away before I allowed myself to fully examine it. That night, sitting beside my wife while rain pressed against the windows of our living room, I stopped doing that. For the first time, I stopped lying to myself. I didn't confront Claire after that. I didn't accuse her of cheating. I didn't start interrogating every sentence she said or checking timestamps like some paranoid husband trying to catch mistakes. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still made coffee in the mornings. Still asked about her day. Still listened while she talked about clients, furniture samples, and impossible deadlines at work. But internally, something had already separated. One night about 2 weeks later, Claire came home late from another literature club meeting smelling faintly of wine and cedar perfume. She kissed my cheek distractedly while slipping off her coat and immediately headed for the shower. I remember standing alone in the kitchen listening to the water running upstairs. The house felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, careful. Her tablet sat charging beside the couch where she'd left it earlier that evening. For a long time, I just stared at it from across the room, telling myself to leave it alone. Then eventually I picked it up. No dramatic music, no shaking hands, just silence. The screen unlocked automatically. The messages were already open. What I found somehow hurt more because it wasn't explicit. There were no photos, no declarations of love. No obvious crossing point I could isolate and hate cleanly. Instead, there were months of conversations stretched across hundreds of messages. Late-night voice notes, private jokes, references to moments I wasn't there for, flirting disguised as intellectual closeness. Claire sounded lighter with him than she had sounded with me in a very long time. That was the part one couldn't stop noticing. Mason sent her book passages at midnight. Claire replied with laughing voice notes. They talked about meetings ending and continuing somewhere else afterward. One message near the bottom stopped me completely. Stay longer after the meeting next time. That was it. Simple, normal looking, almost harmless. But the meaning behind it felt devastatingly obvious. I sat there in the dim light of our living room, scrolling upward through months of emotional betrayal hidden behind literature discussions and carefully chosen words. Upstairs, the shower continued running. I realized then that the affair itself almost didn't matter anymore. The secrecy mattered. The intimacy mattered. The version of herself she had slowly relocated somewhere I no longer had access to mattered. By the time Claire came downstairs wearing sweatpants with damp hair hanging over one shoulder, I was already sitting back in the same spot on the couch. The tablet rested exactly where she had left it. She smiled at me tiredly and asked if I wanted tea. I looked at her for a moment before answering. And somewhere quietly inside myself, I stopped thinking about saving the marriage. After that night, I started paying attention differently. Not emotionally, structurally. It felt less like trying to save a marriage and more like quietly studying a situation I had finally accepted was real. Claire still went to literature club every Thursday evening. But once I stopped arguing with reality inside my own head, the patterns became impossible not to see. She came home from meetings in one of two moods. Either unusually quiet, almost distant, like part of her mind was still somewhere else, or strangely energized in a way she never seemed around me anymore. There was no middle ground. Sometimes she mentioned Mason constantly without realizing it. Mason said that author peaked too early. Mason thinks most people misunderstand that novel. Mason recommended a cafe downtown. Then midway through a sentence, she would suddenly stop herself, like she had become aware of how often his name appeared in our conversations. Every single time, she changed the subject immediately afterward. I never reacted. That seemed to make her more nervous than anger would have. Another detail started bothering me too. After every literature club meeting, Claire showered almost immediately when she got home. Not eventually. Not after relaxing. Immediately. At first I told myself I was imagining significance where there wasn't any. Portland evenings were rainy. The cafe smelled like coffee and old upholstery. Maybe she simply wanted to wash off the smell before bed. But eventually repetition becomes its own kind of evidence. One Thursday, I heard her pull into the driveway just after 10. By the time I reached the front hallway, she was already moving upstairs carrying her phone and purse tightly against her side. "You okay?" I asked casually. "Long night," she answered without stopping. Then she disappeared into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. I stood alone in the hallway listening to the shower start. And for the first time, I realized something uncomfortable about myself. I wasn't devastated anymore. Not in the dramatic sense. I wasn't even angry most of the time. What I felt instead was distance slowly replacing attachment. Every lie she told created a little more space between who I thought she was and who she had quietly become. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually the emotional pain settles into clarity. You stop searching for explanations. You stop hoping for misunderstandings. You simply start seeing things accurately. A few days later, while we ate breakfast together in near silence, I stirred cream into my coffee and said something I had already decided on days earlier. "I've been thinking," I said evenly. "Maybe I should come to one of those literature club meetings sometime." Claire froze for half a second before smiling too quickly. "You? Really?" And right there, before she even answered fully, I already knew the truth. Claire tried to talk me out of joining the literature club harder than someone with nothing to hide probably should have. "You'd hate it," she said the same morning I brought it up again. "Most of the discussions get pretentious fast." I shrugged and kept eating breakfast. "Maybe. Still sounds interesting." She smiled tightly after that, but I noticed she stopped mentioning Mason entirely for the rest of the day. The club met Thursday nights inside an old renovated theater downtown that had been converted into an art space years earlier. The lobby still carried traces of its past life. Faded red carpet, cracked gold trim around the ceilings, old framed photographs of performers nobody remembered anymore. The literature meetings happened in a smaller cafe area near the back. Writers, teachers, journalists, photographers, the kind of people who liked speaking slowly, so ordinary observations sounded profound. Claire introduced me carefully when we arrived, like someone managing variables she couldn't fully control anymore. And then something happened neither of us expected. People liked me immediately. Not because I tried too hard. Because I didn't. I asked questions, made jokes, talked normally instead of performing intelligence for the room. Within 20 minutes, I was debating novels with a high school teacher named Andrea, while two others laughed over a story about disastrous office holiday parties. Across the room, I noticed Claire watching me more than once. Nervously, Mason Reed arrived late. Tall, calm, the kind of man who carried himself with effortless confidence because he already knew people found him interesting. When Claire introduced us, his handshake tightened just slightly too long. "Good to finally meet you," he said smoothly. I smiled back. "Likewise. Feels like I already know you." Something flickered briefly behind his expression. The discussion that night barely mattered. What mattered was observation. Claire laughed differently around him. Mason monitored her reactions constantly. And several people in the group noticed it too, even if nobody openly acknowledged it. Over the next month, I kept attending. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized something else. Claire wasn't special to Mason. Not really. He had a pattern. You could see it in the way certain women reacted around him. Familiarity. Old inside jokes. Lingering attention that suggested emotional lines had blurred before. One woman named Elise stopped attending shortly after I joined. Another member quietly mentioned she and Mason had once become too close during a poetry workshop the previous year. He collected emotional attachments the same way some people collect stories. Carefully, casually, without consequences. And slowly, I realized Claire had mistaken attention for uniqueness. By the fifth meeting, the entire situation had started exhausting me more than hurting me. That surprised me. I used to imagine betrayal would feel explosive if it ever happened to me. Rage. Yelling. Some dramatic collapse people would later describe in lowered voices. Instead, it mostly felt tiring. That Thursday night the rain came down hard enough to blur the theater windows completely. Inside the cafe, yellow lamps reflected softly against wet coats hanging beside the entrance, while people settled into their usual seats with coffee cups and notebooks. I deliberately chose the chair directly across from Claire and Mason. Neither of them liked that. Claire barely looked at me all evening. Whenever Mason spoke, she stared at the table too long before responding. Mason himself kept trying to maintain the relaxed confidence he normally carried so naturally, but I could see small fractures forming underneath it. People sense tension long before they understand it. The discussion moved awkwardly from novels to modern relationships to emotional honesty in fiction, a coincidence almost funny enough to appreciate. At one point, a woman across the room laughed nervously and said, "Everybody lies a little in relationships." Nobody answered her. By the end of the night, the atmosphere felt heavy and unfocused. People checked phones. Conversations drifted sideways. Claire barely spoke at all. Then eventually the moderator closed her notebook and announced they were done for the evening. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. People started standing. That was when I finally spoke. "I think this will probably be my last meeting here." The room quieted almost immediately. Not dramatic silence. Curious silence. Andrea looked over first. "Really? Why?" I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands together calmly. Because by then, calmness mattered more than anger. "I stayed quiet about my wife's book club friend," I said evenly, "right until their next meeting." Nobody moved after that. Claire stared at me like she had stopped breathing entirely. Mason looked down at the table for the first time since I'd met him. I kept my voice level. I honestly spent months convincing myself I misunderstood what was happening. Emotional affairs are easy to hide when everyone involved calls them intellectual. Someone near the back whispered, "Jesus." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my phone gently on the table. "If anybody here thinks I'm being unfair," I continued quietly, "I'm happy to show the messages." Mason immediately stopped pretending to participate in the room. Claire covered her mouth with both hands. And for the first time in months, nobody inside that cafe could hide behind ambiguity anymore. After that night, everything started collapsing without much help from me. I didn't send mass messages. I didn't post screenshots online. I didn't contact anyone's employer or try to publicly destroy either of them. I simply stopped protecting the secret. And once secrecy disappears, affairs usually can't survive normal light. By the next morning, people from the literature club had already started quietly distancing themselves from Mason. Group chats went silent. Planned weekend gatherings suddenly got canceled without explanation. Andrea sent me a short message around noon. "I'm sorry. I think more people suspected than wanted to admit it." I stared at the screen for a while before locking my phone again. That part didn't surprise me. Most social circles survive by pretending uncomfortable things aren't happening until someone forces reality into the middle of the room. Apparently, 2 women walked out of the club permanently after that meeting. Another member confronted Mason privately near the theater parking lot later that week. Nobody told me exactly what was said, but afterward he stopped showing up entirely. The owner of the art space canceled the literature club 3 days later. Officially, it was because the environment no longer aligned with the community atmosphere they wanted associated with the venue. Unofficially, nobody wanted the tension anymore. At home, Claire barely spoke to me after that night. Not because she was angry, because there wasn't much left to say. The strange thing about exposing betrayal calmly is that it removes everyone's ability to hide inside emotional chaos. There were no screaming matches afterward. No dramatic accusations thrown across rooms. Just silence. Heavy silence. We moved around each other carefully inside the house like exhausted strangers trapped in the same waiting room. One evening I came downstairs and found Claire sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at nothing with a mug of cold tea in front of her. For a moment, I almost recognized the woman I married again. Then she quietly asked, "Did you always know?" I leaned against the doorway. "No," I answered honestly. I just stopped ignoring it. She nodded once after that and looked back down at the table. A few weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. Claire placed them carefully beside my coffee cup one morning before work. No speech. No crying. No attempt to explain herself differently now that everything had already collapsed. Just paperwork resting quietly on our kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. I signed them that same evening. Neither of us said much afterward. By then, silence had already finished most of the conversation for us. The day Claire packed the last of her boxes, Portland disappeared behind rain again. Not heavy rain, just that constant gray drizzle the city wears for months at a time, soft enough to ignore until you realize everything around you is soaked through. I stood near the kitchen window watching water slide down the glass, while movers carried the final pieces of our marriage out through the front door. Books, plants, framed photographs, ordinary objects that once looked permanent. The house sounded hollow now. Every room carried that strange, echo-empty places develop almost immediately, like the walls themselves understand when something has ended. Claire moved quietly all morning. No anger, no bitterness, just exhaustion. Around noon, the movers loaded the final box into her car, while I remained standing near the sink, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, eventually, Claire walked back inside one last time to check the hallway closet. When she returned to the kitchen, she stopped a few feet away from me without fully meeting my eyes. "I didn't think you'd find out like this," she said softly. I looked past her toward the rain outside. Cars moved slowly through the wet street beyond our yard. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before everything settled quiet again. And standing there in the remains of our marriage, I realized something strange. By then, it honestly wasn't about Mason anymore. Not really. Mason had simply been the visible part of something already breaking underneath the surface. The real damage happened long before I ever read messages or walked into literature club meetings. It happened in all the small moments where honesty quietly disappeared and neither of us admitted it out loud. I thought about answering her, about asking questions that no longer mattered, about demanding explanations, about trying to locate the exact point where we stopped belonging fully to each other. But the truth was simpler than that. There usually isn't one moment. Just gradual distance people keep ignoring until eventually the silence becomes larger than the relationship itself. So I didn't answer her. Claire stood there for another few seconds waiting for something that never came. Then finally she nodded once to herself, picked up her coat, and walked toward the front door. A minute later I heard her car start outside. Then the sound disappeared slowly into the rain. And for the first time in months, the house became completely still again. A few months later, I walked past the same art cafe by accident. It was early evening. The sidewalks were wet from another Portland rainstorm, and traffic crawled slowly through downtown beneath blurred yellow streetlights. I almost didn't recognize the building at first. The literature club sign was gone. Only the outline remained where it used to hang inside the front window. For a moment, I stopped at the corner across the street and looked inside. The cafe was quieter now. Different people, different conversations. Someone sat near the window reading alone, while an employee wiped tables in the back beneath the dim amber lights. Nothing about the place suggested my marriage had quietly ended there, and that felt strangely appropriate. Most life-changing moments leave no visible evidence behind. I stood there another second, hands in my coat pockets, listening to rain taps softly against parked cars. Then the crosswalk signal changed. And this time, I just kept walking forward. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.